Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland.
Welcome to Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. In local news, there have been no further changes in when Moab can reopen to commerce. However, restaurants have begun to apply for gradual reopening. As of April 16th, establishments such as my favorite donut shop have been allowed to accept people inside their establishment as long as social distancing is respected and takeout orders are done exclusively. Considering it's usually just one man and all he does is take out anyway, that wouldn't be difficult to abide by. Neither would it be the case for one of my favorite burger joints in town, which lets people sit at the outdoor bench if they walk like I do when waiting on their orders, or inside their cars if they drive up as most people do, but no one's allowed inside the restaurant itself that isn't employed. Larger establishments that can serve indoor capacity of hundreds are still restricted to takeout and or delivery depending on what resources they have. On April 23rd, an amendment was proposed which has allowed gyms to reopen under strict conditions, and the city pool will begin a systemic effort to reopen its establishment to members like myself on May 1st as a result. This amendment was passed, allowing establishments such as Southtown Gym to open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. to members exclusively. Last week, the governor came out and supported a structured reopening, to quote him, of the national parks in an effort to allow places like Moab and St. George to see a methodical return of revenue. Since Moab has two national parks upon which it relied for its revenue, this will be welcome financial relief and great news as long as projections remain positive, where the first wave of COVID-19 cases are concerned. However, we did have one new positive as of April 23rd, 2020. However, even so, the whole southeast Tri-County area of Carbon, Emory, and Grand have reached a combined total of nearly 1,000 tests issued, and only that one positive so far, which is really good. In other news, with this amendment that has been passed, exercise pools have also been allowed to open up under certain conditions in the same amendment to the public health order that was released on April 23rd. Only time will tell if this will truly pan out the way I'm hoping, and the way most of us are probably hoping at home, given the talk of an impending second wave already taking place on the national level. With local news over with, I'm pleased to say this is the first Friday of Mental Health Awareness Month, and while autism had its own month, the fact that it is a mental disorder means that it can fit with the theme of Mental Health Awareness Month. As such, we'll have more on the topics at hand after this brief break. Thank you for tuning back into this episode of Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. So as this quarantine drags on, there are signs that people are just plain fed up. As you might have heard in national coverage, protests against the state lockdowns are commencing in Ohio, Virginia, and Minnesota, to name a few places. Now, while I can reasonably say that if there are protests in Utah, they don't go to that extent, I can certainly understand to a degree where the protesters are coming from. Most human beings are social creatures, and as such, being isolated with no more than their beloved ones to socialize with can often be extremely difficult. However, for the autistic populace of our country, the difficulties can be further compiled. You see, one of the key signs of autism spectrum disorder can be, and often is, a reliance on a rather exacting routine. An example of this might be waking up at exactly 8 o'clock a.m. and getting done with breakfast by exactly 9:30 a.m. or something similar. No flexibility, no potential for even being 1 minute off. And that's in a lot of the severe cases. So, with schools closed across the country for the rest of the 2019-2020 school year, routines aplenty are messed up, and this can have really drastic consequences. In severe cases, this can result in meltdowns that can see worldly possessions destroyed and bones broken. On truly severe cases, concussions can oftentimes have occurred, before the quarantine. And I can certainly understand how some parents would be struggling right now to help their autistic children adjust to the changes this quarantine has brought about. Combine that with summer vacation on the way, and it would absolutely make sense for some autistic children to feel like their lives have been pulled out from under them like an old rug. I certainly felt that way when the orders first came down and my after-school program was shut down. But there is still hope. There are signs that support that it won't be too long before the life we knew could be restored, and the FDA has been approved to accelerate the development of antibody treatments, just to name a few of the positive changes in the air. However, a lot of these changes will not come fast enough for members of the autistic community who have been used to one way of life and have had to adjust to another. And it doesn't help any that in having adjusted to another, it's been a long enough period of time to where returning to the life known before might be difficult. It might be, I know that I myself, being autistic, am certainly going to have trouble adjusting to to a return to a routine for a summer vacation as a result of my after-school job being basically shut down for the remainder of the year. I'm going to find it difficult to transition back into what I would normally do when there wasn't quarantine and summer was abound, and I can certainly see how others like me would have similar difficulties. And let's not forget that with kids now being used to school being online, I wouldn't be more than surprised, I would not be surprised at all, if more than a few autistic and non-autistic children alike found themselves in a difficult spot as far as adjusting to returning to the physical classroom is concerned, whether or not they miss their friends. Now, with all this said, we're going to get to more on these sorts of topics through our questions from home after this break. Thank you. Thank you for tuning back into Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. For our segment Questions from Home, we have several questions asked by Daniel from Moab's Grand Area Mentoring. For this week, Daniel has asked, Dear Chris, what's it like to be autistic in our culture? Are there special challenges that the greater public should be aware of? Is autism's prevalence growing, or is it being more thoroughly diagnosed amongst our population? What's the split between male and female? Well, Daniel, I think I'll start with the questions that will be easiest to answer because the first two are hardest. The last one, on the other hand, will be easiest to answer first because it's statistically supported. So far as I'm aware of, the current split is 4-1 in favor of boys. The reason being is that psychologists are finding that autistic females are a lot better at blending into the crowd than males. They're better at more skillfully mimicking things such as social custom most of the time until they can understand it, as opposed to a lot of boys. Also, not all of the symptoms of autism are immediately visible in girls, as it's a lot easier for autistic girls to do things like maintain eye contact as part of that more skillful social mimicry. It's also a consistent pattern with a lot of behavioral or developmental disorders for boys to be more frequently diagnosed. And when talking about our savant or savant style obsessions, a lot of times autistic girls become obsessed on things that are already conventionally accepted, which allows them to slip through the cracks more and more. Case in point would be a girl who obsesses with Disney or hairstyling or some kind of salon talent. When a girl has these kinds of obsessions, convention still supports them pursuing these obsessions. Granted, the times are changing, however. And as the times change, we will notice more of these types of people whose obsession is in hairstyling or anything to do with applying art to the face. As for the ratio of boys versus girls, schizophrenia is another example of a disorder where boys tend to be diagnosed more often than girls, and is another spectrum disorder with varying degrees of severity, just like autism. The only significant difference is in the symptoms that make schizophrenia what it is versus autism spectrum disorder. However, emotional disorders like bipolar tend to appear in girls more often than boys, in sharp contrast to developmental ones like autism. An argument could be made for even psychology being rather patriarchal, but that's besides the point. This leads me to your question about prevalence. I think it's a combination of both of the factors that you pointed out. On the one hand, as we're learning more about autism, schizophrenia, bipolar, etc., we're re-examining cases of people who potentially fit one or more designations and therefore attain the appropriate help. But on the other hand, because we're learning more and in a desire to be proactive, we're discovering more new cases, and that's okay. Unlike COVID-19, none of these are contagious or very likely to kill anyone. Which brings me to the first question, which I'll answer first in the interest of a platform for answering the second one. Frankly, I can't speak for everyone who's on the spectrum in answering your question, though I'd like to believe I share experiences in common with thousands of others who share my disorder. I can't speak for the 50-year-old who just found out he's autistic last month, or the 14-year-old who's known nothing else but his autism since he was 3. But I can speak for myself in answering this question. So, first, I want you to think of every social cue you know by instinct. This is sarcasm, idioms, changes in tone, etc. Take it all and imagine if, instead of being able to know how they work and why they're used instinctively, imagine you knew that all that because you had to think about it actively, day in and day out, under the generous assumption you were ever taught at all. And that's just for conversations as professional as the initial job interview or interacting with coworkers. Never mind the horrendous task of small talk with friends or family. Now, also imagine if, in addition to having to actively think of every social cue you know now, imagine that as a very little child, everyone has faces that seem to remain stoic, or seem like they're pulling a sheet of saran wrap over their faces. Hard. Imagine it being to the extent that any emotion is hidden from you, so that you can't even tell if they're blushing or red with rage at every word that you say. As a child, my experience was a constant series of interactions where I thought I was making the right moves, only for people to explode in my face and then leave me wondering what I did. That, or else they would insult me or say something that hurt me, all the while still leaving me hanging in confusion. What did I do? How could I make it better? To this day, I'm still paranoid about saying the wrong thing, even from the comfort of texting, because of the other reaction I'd get if I did. Getting ghosted online. I can't tell you how many times I'd say something that I thought was a good joke, and then boom, no further contact. It definitely is stressing to have to think about what other people just have naturally. I think the best analogy I ever heard was in a documentary about autistic people involved in a romantic relationship, where the parent of one of these people says that he thought everyone normally just came with a kind of social antenna, and his daughters had had hers broken and had to be put back together with spit and barbed wire and gum and all that kind of stuff, for even a fraction of what comes naturally to people that aren't autistic. See, in answering your second question, I was pleasantly surprised as a result of these experiences to find out that I wasn't alone. When I was looking for literature from Temple Grandin, I stumbled on the name Sean Barron, who was an esteemed journalist on the autism spectrum. As I read a book on which he and Temple collaborated called Unwritten Rules of Social Relationships, I was surprised to see that he had similar experiences to myself, almost the same to a T in many ways. I also found out that we found a similar solution to our problems in a form of writing. Sean found it in reporting, but I found it in writing novels, where I refined my ability to use idioms and metaphors in my Star Wars fanfiction stories before then writing original novels that I published through Amazon. I was then able to say to myself, statistically speaking, that where there was one person like me or Sean Barron with similar experiences, there were at least 100 people that experienced similar results, maybe even 1,000 for every one of us. On the other hand, it seems like the nation is beginning to accept it more. It seems like while there is still trepidation about the future of many people who are autistic, there are things that are happening in our culture and in our talk about autism that promises change to this very culture. Case in point, Dan Aykroyd, who you may know as a Ghostbuster from one of the old movies with Bill Murray, is himself autistic, yet is a well-beloved actor with a wife and 3 kids. Temple Grandin, as mentioned before, is herself autistic and is one of the most prominent authorities on agriculture, animal rights, and autism advocacy in the world. Because she's 73 years old, I highly recommend reading her books whenever you can, as she's old enough to have seen every step in the journey of autism research and has even helped with a lot of it herself, volunteering her brain in MRI studies. I wouldn't be surprised if, in fact, her story was somehow pivotal, almost critical, to the kind of acceptance that I'm starting to see in my world now, which has been beyond phenomenal. When I left Moab and I set out to get a bachelor's degree minimum in education, I set out hoping to achieve some kind of semblance of the same acceptance, or at least tolerance, that Temple Grandin gained in her own line of work. So, saying that I was pleasantly surprised by all that is a little bit of an understatement. However, it's still a mixed bag with a lot left to do. I've encountered situations here in Moab and in my college years over at St. George when I heard uncertainty, even fear, in the voices of parents of autistic children who confided in me their concerns. More than I care to admit, a familiar mantra I heard was, "What can I do?" So I made it a goal of mine to become an educator so that I could help them find the answer in the hopes I can answer my own questions about my future too. Perhaps the stupidest thing, for lack of a politer word, that I've ever heard someone ask me about autism was if it was true that all autistic people are colorblind. Now, you might be wondering why that question sounds so stupid, and that's because there's no evidence to support that autistic people are any more prone to physical defections such as color blindness or full true blindness or anything of that nature any more than is a non-autistic person. With all this in mind, what I can say though is that it's amazing the power of more thorough education on the disorder, and most important, making it easily accessed and understood by parents, students, and professionals alike. It's amazing the difference it makes to have someone in place who can answer the questions these parents have and help their colleagues do the same in a way that everyone can understand. And I'm honored to say I've already made some wonderful memories in this journey. One of my favorite ones? When I worked Beacon After School's kindergarten hour last year, a little boy came up, hugged me from the side after I knelt down to accept, and told me I could never leave with a humongous smile on his face. It might not necessarily be relevant to the topic, but the boy represents the hope, the happiness, and the optimism I'd like to believe I inspire in doing what I do. He also represents, my hope that people who don't have autism can understand that people like me, we do feel, which is one of the things that has been argued about by experts for a long time. In fact, sometimes we feel more intensely than non-autistic people do, despite whatever the criteria might say, and had said at one time of a symptom being no visible displays of empathy or insight. We just don't always know how to express it in a way those who aren't autistic don't always understand. I'd only like to believe in that because of that very admission being made by one of my mentees before the quarantine. And it's an admission that I've made to myself day in, day out. and hope to change someday. Well, I hope I haven't turned on the waterworks too much because it isn't all sad. On the contrary, I say it with hope in my heart, happiness of mind, and a desire to give a lot of laughs yet. Hope that answers all your questions, and so glad you've kept them coming so far. I hold high hopes for the questions you have in the future. And that is a wrap for what I have on the agenda for today's episode of Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland. This has been Autism Fridays with Christopher Cleveland, and I'm your host, Christopher Cleveland. Stay healthy, stay safe, stay at home if you can, unless you're an essential worker, and I'll hope to see you guys on the other side of this crisis. This episode is dedicated to the donut shop on Center Street. At this small and cozy establishment, the owners work diligently to provide excellent, delicious donuts for 5 days of the week. They use ingredients that have been tried and true in donut making for 100 years and have insanely great prices on their food. In fact, they've even gone as far as working the taxes such that the price you see is the price you pay when you go to checkout. Whether you're paying for scrumptious frosted vanilla cake donuts with sprinkles for $1 per donut, or a chocolate long john with no filling for $2, the price you see is the price you pay for, and they're worth every dime paid. Help out this local business today and see for yourself. Starring, edited, directed, produced, and written by Christopher Cleveland. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.